Welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series, brought to you by AKFI, the Actionable Knowledge Foundation Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry association committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. I shall add, of course, AI. Actionable ESG, the talk series, bring together great minds to discuss the current state and the future states of ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. I'm really delighted to be here with our guest, Professor Christopher Marquis. And to start, just a little bit about your bio. You are the senior professor at management at the University of Cambridge and the author of 3 books, which I'll shortly mention. The previous steps in your career took you through Cornell, as well as Harvard for a number of years, as well as through the industry more recently with JP Morgan Chase, where you were vice president. The books that I want to mention, and I'm expecting more to come. The first one, The Profiteers, is how business privatizes profits and socializes costs. A very interesting topic just by reading the title. Your research examines business sustainability and social entrepreneurship, and you also written 2 prior award-winning books, including The Better Business, how the Big Corp movement is remaking capitalism, and Mao and Markets, which should be quite a reading book, is The Communist Road of Chinese Enterprise, and a Financial Times Best Book Award from 2022, during 2022 year. You also hold a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. And of course, your career talks by itself, and of course, the books. So we have many questions for you. But I'd like to start with a broad question about sustainability and capitalism. And
Sure.
how do you see the global expectations now? Because things are changing.
Yeah, good question. Good to start off with. And I also want to say, Manuel, I really enjoy your podcast and looking forward to discussing. So thank you so much for having me on. Uh, so yeah, the sort of current global expectations, challenging question at this point to because we are in a bit of a, I guess, a period of flux, so to speak. I mean, I think, certainly over the past, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, there's been a pretty steady progression towards businesses, government, consumers, investors, all actually prioritizing sustainability, ESG, company social impact in a much more rigorous way. You see this through regulations, through, investment flows, through companies, what they're doing and as far as their, work. This has been a bit turned upside down more recently, particularly in the United States, where there's been a lot of pushback against ESG. This is happening at the US state level, and then obviously at the US federal level, a lot of retrenchment on climate issues, on issues of inequality. I think this is really unfortunate, and I think it's a mistake, to be honest. But my expectation is that, climate disasters sadly are going to continue. The world is going to continue heating up. It's going to continue heating up, unfortunately, in places that, you know, did not contribute as much to climate change. This is the global south, which is going to create a lot of serious societal impacts, migration. I think inequality is going to continue, to grow as it has, really since World War II. I think that these are issues, sadly, that although there's been a retrenchment because of the state of the world, they're unavoidable for companies um, to not address because I think the governments, general publics, and then investors will be also focusing on them. So that's a little bit about where I see, sustainability now.
So first, let me confess, I'm an engineer. I'm coming from a different type of career, but I perceive actually companies being actually more and governments more reactive than proactive. And sustainability to me, it's a proactive move. And
Right.
you absolutely mentioned about the global south, which are countries that are asking for their right to develop now, to develop energy. We know electricity is one of the main producers, especially fossil fuels based energy producing of carbon footprint and greenhouse gases. So, but I'd like to take you a little bit to your
Sure.
latest book, and feel free to talk about the others as well. But this is the Profiteers book, and how companies privatize profits. That's a very interesting topic, and especially how they socialize the costs and what is at play. Is the tax system? It's the economic system. Is the banking system? Are all these systems together?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, so, in some ways, one of the core areas of focus of the book, is encapsulated in the subtitle, which you just, sort of alluded to, how businesses privatize profits and socialize cost. And that is actually just in some ways a common word, way to put the idea of externalities, where companies, a lot of the costs of their, production end up getting passed on to society and the broader environment. And then, the company actually doesn't have to pay for those. So it actually raises, the profit. And, when you're asking about that, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because frequently externalities are talked about in a much more, sort of almost mathematical way in
Hmm.
economics or in accounting, where, you put a price on it or you create a market. These are, most famous example is carbon pricing. So the idea that, carbon emissions are an externality, business doesn't have to pay for the damage that they create to, you know, as a result of global warming, which we were just talking about, or, as a result of health issues that maybe people in the area where they're being emitted are suffering. So, the idea, put a price on it. However, what I try to do in the book is say, I think that the idea of being able to put a number on it is in some ways a false sense of security, because that number is filled with a bunch of assumptions. And through lobbying, PR, communication, companies are working very hard to sort of shape our idea of what that number is or should be. And so, just as a quick example, again, sort of on carbon emissions, on carbon pricing. So when Barack Obama was president of the United States, he actually had the first investigation at the US government level around, cost of carbon. They assigned a cost of $42 a ton of carbon. So, when the government was estimating, costs and damages, that was factored in. Donald Trump came into office, and his administration, just by changing a very few assumptions, actually lowered the cost of carbon to about $3. So yeah, so this, basically it's you change the discount rate on the damage, and also, the Obama carbon emissions, or sort of carbon estimate, took the whole world into account, because actually, global warming is a global phenomenon. It's not just sort of, you can't just sort of, put a wall around the United States. But Donald Trump said, okay, we're just going to care about the U.S. Damage, and so with those assumptions, the cost was dropped, dramatically. And I think, companies are very much involved in lobbying and PR and communication to try to shape the government, shape our thinking as in, people, is a lot. I go through a lot of, in some ways, scandals in the book, that have come out as a result of, journalistic investigations or court cases. And so, a couple that are well known that sort of illustrate this is one, the fossil fuel companies have known since the 1970s that carbon emissions were linked to global warming, but they
Right.
sort of lied, misinformation, lobbying to try to actually obscure that externality. Similarly, the plastic industry and industry associations, beverage companies, know that a lot of the plastic they put out there is not recyclable, but they do things like put recycling badges on it and talk about the fact they're recycling because they don't want people pointing, at them that they're creating the waste. They want the responsibility to be on the consumer, like, oh, we need to recycle. So, yeah, so I try to really understand how socially and politically constructed these externalities are, which are, as a result of corporate action.
And you're bringing, as I mentioned, I'm an engineer, so you're bringing the ideas of systems thinking
Yes,
in economics. In other words, it's not enough to think linearly or without looking at the feedback loops. And the problem I see with sustainability, as you mentioned already, probably also in your book, as you mentioned, there are different time lags differences on our
right,
actions. Well, enterprises, and I think you should actually mention, are working on a clock of 3 months and 1 year because they have to produce all these results. So
sure.
if you think in terms of time, there are different timelines. The impact on the environment is slow going, but also it's very hard to correct.
Yep, yeah, very much agree.
And if you have a minute, maybe you can also talk about the other two books. They have both of them have exciting titles. So,
Yeah, sure. So the one that's most closely related to the profiteers and the topics we've been discussing on sustainability is the first book I wrote called Better Business: How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. And the theme of that book, in some ways, it's almost the profiteers and better business are almost like two sides of the same coin. In Better Business, I really look much more deeply at issues of corporate accountability, corporate governance, to actually overcome many of these issues with externalities that I identify, in the profiteers. And I should say, a focal topic in Better Business is, companies that are, certifying are being certified for their social environmental impact, B corporations, they're called. And I have long-standing sort of research focus on B corporations. However, the point of the book is not that all companies should be B Corps, but that this community has been much more like a social movement in trying to change different elements of our economic system. Corporate accountability is one. They've been involved in changing laws and corporate governance
mhm.
of companies so that they can actually, not be sort of beholden to the short-term interests that you just recently talked about. Part of the issue why companies do that is that it's actually part of their legal charter that they have to, be very responsive to their, investor owners, and also changing the investment markets in various ways. So that's sort of Better Business is really focusing much more on corporate accountability and corporate governance to actually overcome some of these issues. The third book, Bound Markets, actually stems from work that I've done over the past, I guess I was gonna say the past 10 years, but now it's a little bit removed. So from 2010 to 2020, I did a lot of research on sustainability in China. During that time period, I lived in China for over 3 years. I, talked to hundreds of companies and have done a lot of research papers on Chinese companies' sustainability and social responsibility work. Uh, Part of that, time that I spent there and engaging with companies, I became really interested in the economic model in China more generally. You have this ostensibly, communist regime, and you have a market economy. And I say ostensibly communist. What I mean by that is, I think there are where there are a lot of elements that are similar to maybe what the USSR had had implemented in the past around, state ownership of core industries like, energy and communication and finance, heavy centralization of policymaking, sort of control, no elections, or at least not for the serious positions. Um, what they've paired it with is a lot of market-based features, particularly in sort of other industries. And so there's been this flowering of e-commerce, et cetera. So how these two elements combine was a real impetus behind this book and why I wrote it. And, the punchline in some ways is that I think the West has really overestimated the extent of market liberalization. And this is now sort of much more accepted. When we were doing these papers, it was a little bit newer. I think our book might have helped sort of popularize this idea a bit. But the fact that, you know, this, if you liberalize your economy, you're going to have political liberalization, I think was a standard line of thinking in regards to China. But actually, with Xi Jinping, the reverse has been shown. Actually, over the last 40, the 40 years from, 1978 to, 2008 or so, or 2000, he started his term in 2011 or 12. They had this really incredible growth story, lots of liberalization. So based on traditional theories, people would think that they would be liberalizing, sort of politically, but actually Xi Jinping has done the opposite, has actually tightened the political control, the ideological control. And what our book argues is that actually, you can actually see how this occurred by looking historically back to basically Chairman Mao and early days of the Chinese Communist Party. So long-winded answer describing those two books, but that's the basic
I,
punchlines.
I spent quite a lot of time working over 10 years as chief marketing officer for a region lately, Latin America, for
Okay,
Huawei, but I spent quite a lot of time in China. And my impression is, naively so, that the Communist Party never liberalized the entire economy. They kept the banking, they kept the
sure.
telecoms. People were or experts were amazed that CEOs moved from a position to another. Let's say head of a bank, then head of telecom, which
Yeah,
is uncharacteristic for a capitalistic system.
sure.
So I think we read too much Chinese propaganda and not enough
Right.
trying to get our, as you did 3 years, it's a good time to get the feet
Yeah,
on the ground and see what really happens there. And I think they understand how USSR fell apart. I'm not sure if there is a system, a socio-economic system that can be both liberal and liberalized and control. I think what I'm
sure.
saying is
Yeah.
a contradiction in terms already.
Yes, interesting. Yeah, great.
So that's my experience. On the other hand, what I found at Huawei, a very vibrant industry, very innovative. They spent many years being a close follower of the
Sure.
competition, but
Right.
eventually they proved that they can take over. And now Huawei it's not in the US, but it's a force in
Sure.
other countries. And
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of, if you look at, I mean, that's something, I mean, I'm generally pretty critical of sort of the Chinese system, but I think a lot of these companies have been such incredible innovation stories like Huawei, like Alibaba, Tencent, like you're saying, I mean, I think for a long time would get, dismissed as being just, copiers or, fast followers, or just, able to deliver things cheaply because they have lower labor costs. But really and truly, there's been some really important fundamental innovations. You look at the electric vehicle sector as an example. I think that China has really leapfrogged the entire world. So there, whereas their previous auto industry and internal combustion engine, I mean, the cars were really not very good.
I think there is also a little bit of innovator's dilemma because the Chinese
Sure.
car industry was not really able to copy the complexity of a Mercedes-Benz or a Ford.
Right.
And then they leapfrog, as you said, by
Yep.
actually adopting a technology. As I said, I'm an electronic engineer, which is much more, for me, simpler to understand than the mechanical
Sure.
system with all kind of, moving parts.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So that's a little bit about this. I think this trend of leapfrogging with innovator's dilemma, right? The book
Yeah.
on innovation. Uh, and thank you for sharing about China. I think we can have a whole follow-up
Yeah,
talk about
exactly.
China only.
Yeah, interesting
Uh,
to hear about it was very interesting to hear about your experience too. I didn't realize that background you had.
Yeah, well, actually, I was sort of on the international part of the company, so I had the opportunity to travel around many of the customers of Huawei. I was also part of the what they call it, the Huawei University, so I was a professor there. So
Oh,
I met a lot of the people in Huawei that were my students for especially business classes.
got it.
So I, keeping with corporate accountability and greenwashing, and to color a little bit, no pun intended, to color a little bit the discussion. Um, how do you see two things? The role of double materiality in most legislations now. I know the federal is on hold for the US, the
Sure.
SEC legislation. But Europe kept it even with changes to the dates and the size of the reporting for sustainability. And actually, large economies like California, which is the fourth largest economy now in the world, on itself uh, kept the principles in their regulation. So, more specifically, how do you see corporate accountability playing? And let's try to look a little bit globally, because if you are a global company, it's hard for you to say, I don't want to do business in California, I
Right.
don't want to do business in
Or the
Europe.
EU, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In EU or UK. But
Yeah.
I definitely want the revenue to grow every year.
Yeah, I mean, corporate accountability is so incredibly important for many reasons. I mean, obviously, as the term suggests, I mean, it's about holding companies to account about their social and environmental impacts. There is a line of critique of ESG that by focusing too much on accountability, you create a system of just sort of check boxes, and it actually minimizes companies' ability to actually do the real good work. I think that's something that's important to keep an eye on, but my experience with hundreds of companies now, the what happens when you begin sort of measuring, documenting, really it's a process of sort of understanding and benchmarking and how to become better. When you are actually, I can't even tell you how many companies I've talked to that have told me that, boy, we really didn't realize the gaps that we had in our organization until we actually sat down and started, needing to, measure and report on those. And so I think that from many perspectives, obviously the accountability perspective, but also just the sort of learning process improvement perspective, that, measurement reporting around, and accountability is super essential for us to become more sustainable. I think, you mentioned double materiality. This is something that is incredibly important too. I think that it's not as well known or sort of understood. So, most of your listeners probably know about it, but if they don't, traditionally materiality has been thought of as financial materiality. So is this in accounting something that investors should know about because it may materially impact the future earnings of the firm? And I think a lot of ESG um, discussions around impact and what needs to be made accountable for is seen through this investor materiality lens. I mean, carbon emissions. I mean, is there going to be a carbon tax? That obviously is something that would be important for investors to know if the company's emitting a lot of carbon. So that becomes like a financial material. And this is the avenue that the U.S. SEC has always been been very following. And I think that what the EU has done, particularly, with there's this corporate sustainability reporting directive, CSRD, that actually, stipulates this double materiality. And so the other materiality is impact materiality beyond financial materiality. So is it a material impact to society and the environment? And if you ask me, from a government perspective, the government should be thinking about the general population, the public good. So
Mhm.
investor materiality, aside from like maybe securities laws, I don't think is where the government should be focusing attention. The government should be focusing its attention on what is the impact to, our, environment and world. And so I think that, the EU adopting that is hugely important because, one, it raises the bar on what companies are accountable for in an important way, but
Mhm.
also in regards to this, CSRD and other, other directives, it requires companies to report even if they're not on their global operations. So, for instance, as it rolls out, it has a complex rollout schedule, which probably are too much detailed, and I probably don't remember all the details, so we won't be able to talk about it here. People should Google it if they're interested. But by the end of this decade, when it's fully rolled out, you know, companies will have to be reporting on their global operations. So if you are Nike, for instance, a U.S. company, you're selling shoes in the EU, you will be responsible to report or be accountable for your entire global operation ESG reporting. And I think this is something, that the EU has done that is really smart because so much of like stringent social and environmental policy sometimes will lead to a race to the bottom where companies will say, "Oh, I don't want to do business in the EU, so this is a big hassle, so I'll pull out." I'll just maybe minimize or focus. But this is something where it encompasses the entire entire world. So it's I think it's pretty significant stuff.